Western Australia calls itself the Wildflower State, and every spring it proves the point. Endless fields of everlastings turn the outback pink and white for a few short weeks, kangaroo paw grows wild along bush tracks, and Kings Park in Perth hosts one of the largest urban wildflower displays on Earth. Tourists plan entire road trips around the bloom season, chasing colour across a state so large it could swallow most of Western Europe. What the tourism brochures leave out is that this same vast, isolated landscape has a colonial and industrial history built on shipwreck, forced removal, racial violence, and labour so dangerous it killed people by the hundreds. Western Australia's isolation, the very quality that makes its wildflower season feel so untouched and remote, also made it one of the easiest places in the country to hide brutality from public view. In this video, we are counting down 12 dark chapters buried beneath Western Australia's colourful image. Stay until the end, because the final one happened in the exact valley that fills with wildflowers every single spring. So settle in, and let's begin. Western Australia calls itself the Wildflower State, and every spring it proves the point. Endless fields of everlastings turn the outback pink and white for a few short weeks, kangaroo paw grows wild along bush tracks, and Kings Park in Perth hosts one of the largest urban wildflower displays on Earth. Tourists plan entire road trips around the bloom season, chasing colour across a state so large it could swallow most of Western Europe. What the tourism brochures leave out is that this same vast, isolated landscape has a colonial and industrial history built on shipwreck, forced removal, racial violence, and labour so dangerous it killed people by the hundreds. Western Australia's isolation, the very quality that makes its wildflower season feel so untouched and remote, also made it one of the easiest places in the country to hide brutality from public view. In this video, we are counting down 12 dark chapters buried beneath Western Australia's colourful image. Stay until the end, because the final one happened in the exact valley that fills with wildflowers every single spring. So settle in, and let's begin. North of Perth near the town of Mogumba, the Moore River Native Settlement operated from 1918 until 1951 as one of Western Australia's central institutions in the government policy that forcibly removed Aboriginal children from their families, a practice now recognised as a major contributor to what is known nationally as the stolen generations. Children brought to the settlement, often taken from their mothers by police acting under state authority, were housed in dormitories, given minimal education focused on preparing them for domestic or manual labour, and actively discouraged or punished for speaking their own languages or maintaining connections to their cultural identity. Conditions at the settlement were chronically poor, with overcrowding, malnutrition, and disease outbreaks documented in official inquiries conducted even during the institution's operation. The settlement gained international attention decades after its closure through the true story of 3 girls who escaped in 1931 and walked over 1,600 kilometres home along the rabbit-proof fence, a journey later documented in both a memoir and a widely seen film. Today, the site is largely reclaimed by bush, and a memorial acknowledges the thousands of Aboriginal children who passed through its gates, many never reunited with the families they were taken from. Broome's pearling industry, which built the town into one of the wealthiest ports in colonial Australia by the early 20th century, was sustained by a labour force that paid an extraordinary human cost largely absent from the pearl jewellery sold to distant markets. Divers, initially local Aboriginal people and later heavily recruited workers from Japan, the Philippines, and other parts of Asia, descended repeatedly to dangerous depths in heavy diving suits to harvest pearl shell, facing constant risk from decompression sickness, shark attacks, and equipment failure in an era before modern understanding of diving safety existed. Historical records indicate that hundreds of divers died over the industry's peak decades, with Japanese divers making up the largest single group of fatalities, their deaths so numerous that Broome's Japanese cemetery today holds several hundred graves, one of the largest Japanese cemeteries outside Japan itself. Working conditions were frequently exploitative, with many Asian and Aboriginal divers bound by contracts that left them with little genuine bargaining power over the risks they were required to take. The pearling luggers that once dominated Broome's harbour have been replaced by a modern cultured pearl industry, but the cemetery remains as the clearest record of what the original industry cost. On the remote Pilbara coast, the once thriving port town of Cossack now stands almost entirely empty, its heritage stone buildings preserved but its streets permanently deserted. Established in 1863 as Western Australia's first pearling port, Cossack grew quickly into a significant regional hub, complete with a customs house, a courthouse, and a police station serving the pearling luggers and the broader northwest coastal trade. The town's location, however, made it acutely vulnerable to the cyclones that regularly sweep across the Pilbara coast during the wet season, and repeated cyclone damage throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries steadily undermined the port's viability, destroying infrastructure faster than the remote settlement could reasonably rebuild it. As the pearling industry itself relocated toward the deeper, more sheltered harbour at nearby Port Sampson and then Broome, Cossack's population drained away almost entirely by the 1950s, leaving behind a genuinely eerie collection of intact stone buildings with no town left to use them. Today Cossack is preserved as a heritage site, its old courthouse now a small museum, standing as a rare example of an entire colonial era port abandoned not through economic decline alone but repeatedly battered into irrelevance by the same coastline that once made it valuable. In the Dampier archipelago off the Pilbara coast, a series of islands and coastal waters were the site, in February 1868, of one of Western Australia's most severe recorded incidents of frontier violence against Aboriginal people. Following the killing of a European police constable and the wounding of another settler, a large punitive expedition of police and armed civilians launched a retaliatory campaign against local Jandamarra people across the archipelago's islands and coastline, an operation that continued for weeks and became known as the Flying Foam Massacre. Historical estimates of the death toll vary considerably, ranging from around 20 to as many as 150 Jandamarra people killed, with a wide range reflecting the deliberately poor and inconsistent record-keeping surrounding frontier violence during this period of colonial expansion. The Jandamarra population, already small before the massacre, was reduced so severely that the group essentially ceased to exist as an intact community in the years that followed. The islands today form part of the Murujuga area, internationally significant for ancient rock art, a landscape carrying both extraordinary cultural depth and a largely unacknowledged massacre history within the same physical ground. In January 1934, the goldfield city of Kalgoorlie became the site of one of the most serious outbreaks of racially motivated urban violence in Australian history, following the death of an Australian-born man during an altercation involving Italian and other southern European migrant workers on the goldfields. In the days that followed, mobs numbering in the thousands rampaged through Kalgoorlie and neighbouring Boulder, specifically targeting businesses, boarding houses, and properties owned by Italian, Yugoslav, and Greek migrants, destroying dozens of buildings in a wave of arson and looting that overwhelmed the small local police force. At least one migrant worker was killed during the violence, and numerous others were seriously injured, with many migrant families fleeing the goldfields entirely in the riots' aftermath, some never returning to rebuild businesses that represented years of accumulated savings and labour. The riots exposed deep resentment among some Anglo-Australian mine workers toward migrant labour competing for jobs during the difficult economic conditions of the Depression era. The event remains one of the largest race riots in Australian history, though it receives comparatively little attention in broader national historical memory compared to other chapters of the country's past. Kalgoorlie's Golden Mile, once described as the richest square mile of earth on the planet, generated extraordinary wealth from gold extraction beginning in the 1890s, but the underground and open-cut mining operations that made the city famous also killed workers at a rate that was considered a routine cost of the industry for much of its history. Deep underground mining exposed workers to constant risks from rockfalls, mine collapses, and equipment failures, while poor ventilation in deeper shafts contributed to respiratory diseases that killed miners slowly over years after they had left the industry entirely, a toll that rarely appeared in official mining death statistics focused only on immediate accidents. Silicosis, caused by prolonged exposure to fine rock dust generated during drilling and blasting, became so common among Kalgoorlie miners that the disease developed a strong regional association with the goldfields, shortening the life expectancy of an entire generation of underground workers. The transition toward the massive open-cut super pit operation in the late 20th century changed the nature of the risks but did not eliminate them entirely. Today, the super pit remains one of Australia's largest open-cut mines, its terraced walls visible from space, a monument to wealth extracted at a human cost the goldfields rarely advertised to the tourists now offered lookout tours of the pit's edge. Near Albany on Western Australia's southern coast, Cheynes Beach whaling station operated from 1952 until 1978, earning the notable distinction of being the last operating whaling station in the entire southern hemisphere before international pressure and collapsing whale populations finally forced its closure. During its operational decades, the station processed thousands of sperm whales, hauling carcasses onto slipways where workers stripped blubber and rendered oil in an industrial process that locals who work there describe as brutally physical, dangerous, and, in hindsight, difficult to reconcile with modern understanding of whale intelligence and population collapse. The station's final years of operation coincided directly with the emergence of the global anti-whaling movement, and Albany itself became a focal point for early environmental protests as activists specifically targeted the station's continued operation even as similar facilities elsewhere in the world had already closed. When Cheynes Beach finally ceased operations in 1978, It marked a symbolic end to commercial whaling not just in Australia but across the entire southern hemisphere. The station's original buildings and slipway have since been preserved as the Albany Whaling Museum, allowing visitors to walk through the same processing sheds where an industry that killed tens of thousands of whales off the Western Australian coast finally came to its end. Albany's King George Sound holds a different kind of weight in Western Australian history, serving in November 1914 as the final assembly point for the first major convoy of Australian and New Zealand troops departing for the First World War. More than 30,000 soldiers gathered aboard dozens of troop ships anchored in the Sound before departing together for the Middle East and, ultimately, the Gallipoli campaign, meaning Albany became, for tens of thousands of young men, the last piece of Australian soil they ever saw before the war claimed a significant proportion of their lives in the fighting that followed. Locals who witnessed the convoy's departure described an atmosphere of genuine celebration and pride that stood in stark contrast to the losses that would follow within the year. The city has since become a significant site of Anzac remembrance, with a National Anzac Centre built specifically to honour this history, overlooking the same waters where the convoy once gathered before disappearing over the horizon. For families across Australia and New Zealand whose relatives departed from this exact harbour and never returned, King George Sound remains, more than a century later, the last known location where thousands of soldiers were seen alive by anyone who loved them. In the rugged Kimberley region of Western Australia's far north, a Bunuba man named Jandamarra led one of the most sustained and effective armed resistance campaigns against colonial expansion anywhere in Australian history. Initially working as a police tracker in the 1890s, Jandamarra turned against colonial authority after witnessing the impact of pastoral expansion on Bunuba land and people, and in 1894 he killed a fellow police officer before leading a guerrilla campaign from the region's extensive limestone cave systems, using intimate knowledge of the Kimberley's terrain to evade capture for years while conducting raids against colonial settlers and police patrols. Colonial forces launched repeated expeditions specifically to hunt Jandamarra, and his resistance became a significant obstacle to pastoral expansion across Bunuba country during a period when most Aboriginal resistance elsewhere in the colony had already been suppressed through overwhelming force. He was finally killed in 1897 at Tunnel Creek, one of his key hideout locations, after a lengthy pursuit that had made him a figure of frustration for colonial authorities and a source of pride within Bunuba oral history. Today Jandamarra is recognised as one of the most significant Aboriginal resistance leaders in Australian history, and Tunnel Creek and Pinjarra Gorge, both central to his campaign, are now national parks that draw tourists largely unaware of the war fought across this exact landscape. In the East Kimberley, the construction of the Ord River Dam in the 1960s and 1970s created Lake Argyle, one of Australia's largest artificial reservoirs, an engineering achievement celebrated at the time as transforming the region's agricultural potential, but one that came at a cultural cost rarely mentioned in the scheme's official history. The rising waters behind the new dam permanently flooded a significant area of traditional land belonging to the Miriwong and other local Aboriginal groups, submerging sites of deep cultural and spiritual significance that had been used for ceremony, hunting, and daily life for countless generations before the scheme was ever proposed. Communities affected by the flooding received limited consultation by the standards expected today, reflecting the broader pattern of development decisions made across northern Australia during this period with minimal regard for Aboriginal land rights. The agricultural transformation the scheme promised also arrived slower and smaller than originally projected. Today Lake Argyle is promoted as a spectacular tourist destination, its vast blue water surrounded by rugged Kimberley ranges, its surface disguising a landscape of flooded sacred sites that the Miriwong people continue to hold significant even though they now lie permanently underwater. Every spring, the Murray Valley southeast of Perth fills with carpets of pink and white everlastings, drawing wildflower tourists from across the world to walk trails through some of the most photographed blooms in the entire state, precisely the kind of scene that gave Western Australia its Wildflower State nickname in the first place. Few of those tourists know they are walking across the site of the Pinjarra Massacre, one of the most significant and violent confrontations of the frontier period, which took place along the Murray River in October 1834. A detachment of colonial soldiers and settlers, led personally by the colony's governor, attacked a group of Pinjarra Noongar people camped along the riverbank, killing an estimated 15 to 30 people in a coordinated assault that colonial authorities at the time described defensively as a necessary response to earlier conflicts over land and resources. Contemporary Noongar oral history has long maintained that the true death toll was considerably higher than official colonial accounts recorded, and the massacre remains a significant and actively commemorated event within the local Aboriginal community today. The wildflowers that now draw photographers to the Murray Valley each spring bloom across the same ground where one of Western Australia's deadliest colonial confrontations took place, a landscape that fills with colour every year over a history the tourism industry rarely mentions.